Abortion, it is a topic that has become very taboo to speak about right here in our country. But the reality is in Canada, approximately 100,000 abortions take place each and every year. In fact, it's legal to have an abortion right up to the moment of birth. To discuss this very controversial topic is Peter Heck, a public speaker, pro-lifer, and a teacher joining us from Kokomo, Indiana. Welcome to Canada. Welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you very much. First time here. It's great.
See, and for the polar vortex too, which is
kind of perfect timing. Timing, yeah.
Well, it's good to have you here, Peter.
Thank
now,
you.
Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, has gone on record saying pro-lifers are really not in line with what we believe as Canadians. I think a lot of Canadians would disagree with Justin Trudeau.
I hope so.
What would you say in response to our Prime Minister and his remarks?
Well, I think it's startling when you recognize really the foundation points of Western civilization, of which Canada is a key integral part. All of Western civilization predicated upon these ideas of the natural rights of man. And for a Prime Minister to suggest that holding to that is somehow out of touch with where society is, I think is a profound commentary, at least on where he believes the direction, the future of, and I don't just say Canada, I feel like Western civilization, North America, where we are as a people, and it's alarming to say the least.
Wasn't it scary, the fact that you can actually have an abortion right up until the term, like the baby's about to be born?
It is.
That's murder.
It is.
Think about it. Where is the United States headed when it comes to abortion?
Well, you've seen in recent days with the passage of the Reproductive Health Act in the state of New York, followed by the proposed bill in Virginia that was shot down, but then Governor Northam had gone on to a program sort of like this and had defended the notion of, okay, well, you have a baby that's born, the baby will be kept comfortable, and then decisions will be made. Well, that's infanticide. And so one of the things that pro-life activists have said for years is essentially every argument for abortion becomes an argument for infanticide. And so it is, typically those on the opposite side will say, well, this is slippery slope argumentation. It may be, but now that we're seeing it play out, I think we're seeing the consequences of a bad thought that has been allowed to germinate and grow.
Life is so precious. We all know that, right? And especially, I mean, I'm a father myself. Yeah. You a father as well?
Yes, 3 kids.
So you know, I mean, I held my son and my daughter in my hand when they were first born. You know, cut the umbilical cord. It was such a blessing, the gift of life. How did we reach this point, Peter?
Well,
how did we get this far?
To me, and it's impossible for me to address this or any issue without understanding that our worldview is the basis of everything. And so when I come from a Christian perspective and I understand that there is a God that exists, that He gives every being His image, that's what makes life inviolable. Well, you have a society and a culture that is rebelling against God's authority. And we read in Scripture, when man does that long enough, eventually God turns you over to a depraved mind. You do what ought not to be done, Paul writes. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the logical consequence of man stumbling around in the darkness, trying to form his own sense of morality, completely detached. Our intellectual, moral moorings have been ripped free from their foundation. And so it's why you have laws in the state of California that forbid the killing of a pregnant woman and her child. You can get 2 counts of murder there, but the same state would allow a pregnant mother to go in and kill that life, and it would be regarded as a moral choice. It's nonsense. Everybody understands it's nonsense, but we pretend otherwise because we're flapping in the breeze of moral relativity.
Now, some states in the United States say as well that you have to have an ultrasound when you're pregnant just to show the baby growing inside your belly before you decide to make that decision of having an abortion. Right. Let's get your thoughts on that.
My state, Indiana, is one of those states, and it's part of, I think it's been called the incremental approach of pro-life activists for the last several years. Since our law in 1973, the Supreme Court ruling, we've been fighting it since then. But the idea of we may not have enough Supreme Court justices to overturn the Roe v. Wade ruling, but we can at least begin to chip away at it. And so ultrasounds, you look at the statistics of how few women choose abortion when they are presented with an ultrasound that shows what's living inside them. I think it goes, and I don't want to say as a testament to, because that makes it sound like I'm applauding it, but the success of the pro-abortion activists at clouding and creating some sort of mystery as to what is conceived in the womb. It's why whenever I have the conversation with folks about this issue, my first question is, what's in the womb? I need to know what is in the womb. If it's not human life, then we can have this conversation about, but if it is, so tell me what's in the womb. And it's very difficult for someone to ignore what we now know scientifically about that.
So what do you say, Peter, to a woman who says, this is my body, this is my choice, especially if I've been raped? I don't want to carry this seed
Sure.
all the way to term.
Sure.
You know, I'll be traumatized. And some people say, well, you give up this child for adoption, right? So many needy families out there. But she says, again, at the end of the day, this is my choice.
Right.
What do you say to that person?
Well, first of all, there's two things to say. Number one, anyone that's gone through a horror like that, I always say to many of my pro-abortion friends that I actually think that I probably favor harsher penalties for the rapists than they do. So in no way are you taking it easy on the horror that's taken place. You're addressing the reality of what rape is and the assault that took place. That said, any sane moral society does not punish a child for the sins of his or her father. And the idea that the innocent child, and that's where we are today in the United States, where states have banned a man rapes a woman, he cannot receive the death penalty for his decision to rape a woman. But the innocent child that is the byproduct of that act can receive the death penalty. That's a society that has lost its moral grounding.
How about a woman that has her life in jeopardy?
Sure.
You choose between the baby
Right.
and the child.
Right.
You know?
One of the things that
That's a scary decision you have to make,
It
especially
is.
if you're sitting down as a husband, a potential father with the
Absolutely.
doctor. You choose your wife, or do you
Right.
choose your unborn child?
Right. The issue whenever someone brings up the life of the mother, and I've always stressed this, and I always initially get pushback, there has never been and there never will be a case where the mother's life requires the intentional killing of the child. When you have a child, there are very rare cases where carrying the child to term and delivery would imperil the woman's life. There's no question about that. And in those cases, what a godly, moral, I believe sane society would do is to remove the baby from the womb in a non-violent manner, save the woman's life, and then use all of your known medical technology to attempt to save the life of the child as well. Never is there a medical circumstance where you have to intentionally dismember a child in the sanctuary of the womb in order to save the mother's life. And that, again, has been a lie that's been peddled by the other side. And I always ask, why? Why do we need to lie about this issue? Let's address it for what it is and deal with it intellectually, philosophically, morally, by telling the truth. And then we can have it out as far as an intellectual exchange. But whenever I hear, well, you have to save the woman's life by dismembering a child, it's not true.
How about some of the cultures around the world that specifically want to have boys being born? And when they hear or they see from an ultrasound that it's a girl, they abort the child.
Right. One of the things that amazes me, we have going on right now in the United States on Twitter and all social media, the Me Too movement, the idea of women's rights and the rights of females and all of these things, which, by golly, I'm all for.
Yeah, it's very important.
I'm wondering, where are those voices speaking out against these intentionally destructive and aggressive policies targeting women around the world? I just, it's sad, it's sick, and it's the actions of a lost world.
Let me ask you something. How do abortion rights activists respond when they see images of children being ripped apart and thrown away in a garbage can? A human life, a precious human life like that. When they see those images.
I don't, I think it's one of the reasons why there are such harsh restrictions on where those images can be portrayed and seen. City councils banning them from billboards and from public mailers and those sorts of things.
We've had the same thing here in Lethbridge, as a matter of fact,
right.
Pro-life ads taken off the bus
Exactly
benches.
right.
And, you know, off the buses as well. After 100 email complaints, we have 100,000
Right.
people here in Lethbridge.
Right,
So
right.
it's a small portion.
But the squeaky wheel, and not just the squeaky wheel, but sometimes the well-positioned wheel that has friends in the right places. But to your point, to your question, I think largely they avoid those images, or they say that it's appealing to emotion, which is always interesting given that this is the same side that will always bring up the exceptional cases of rape or the life of the mother, which appeal to emotion. I think it's important to that those images are seen so we grasp what it is.
Let me ask you something, Peter. What role should the Christian church play in protecting the lives of these unborn babies?
I think it's interesting when you look at the history of Germany during the Holocaust era. There are literally thousands of ministers and churches throughout the country, but you remember two. You remember Dietrich Bonhoeffer and you remember Martin Niemöller, two names of those who spoke up against the Holocaust and what was happening there in their country. I think there's a lesson to be learned there, that when the history of our time is written, God's champions are going to be those who weren't afraid of what men would say, what men would do, the consequences that man can. Instead, chose to say, look, we stand for God, therefore we stand for life, and we're not going to compromise on that. And I think that any Bible-believing Christian has a responsibility to articulate those principles. We have a better way. We know a better way. Why would we keep that to ourselves?
Here in Alberta, the provincial government has brought forth by law this law and legislation creating a bubble zone around abortion clinics in the big cities, Calgary and Edmonton, not allowing pro-lifers or people to say, hey, you're making a mistake here, from protesting,
Right.
getting too close. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's interesting that we always refer to this as the pro-choice movement, largely because the reason I say it's interesting, if you believe in choice, if you believe that a woman should have the choice to abort or not abort, wouldn't we want that woman to have all of the information, access to all of the ultrasounds, all of these things that we now know? Why would we be blocking women from having access to those things? Why would these abortion clinics not want all of that literature out there if all we care about is truly choice? What that reveals to me when you see those laws passed, it's not choice that we're after. It is the promotion of what has become the sacrament of abortion, which is a bit macabre, if I could use that term, because that's essentially what we're experiencing.
I have friends in Edmonton, which is in northern Alberta, well, central northern Alberta here, and they had to wait for many years to adopt. And they had to end up, because the waiting list was so long here in Canada, they adopted a child from the States and from China. Because the fact that there weren't enough children to adopt here in Canada.
Right.
So maybe if less people were having abortions and maybe bringing the babies to term, giving them up for adoption, we wouldn't have this long waiting list.
Right. The notion that, well, these are unwanted children is preposterous. There is no child that is an unwanted child. Someone wants every child. And even that being said, I always feel like it's necessary to state this, even if there wasn't a line of people waiting to adopt, that doesn't justify killing other human beings. This notion that murder is a solution to our social problems, that isn't a decision that sound, rational minds will come to.
Or convenience. It's like, no, I don't want to have
Exactly
a child right now, so let's
Right.
just get rid of it.
I was, years ago, I was on the radio, and a caller to the program suggested that if I wasn't willing to adopt all of these children, then I shouldn't be speaking out about abortion. And I simply posed this question to them. I said, okay, I have 3 children at home. If I said right now, either you adopt my children or I'll go home and kill my children, let's say that you can't, you're not in a position to adopt them. Does that somehow morally justify me going home and killing my children, or would you still say that that's wrong even though you can't? He got my point. He didn't want to get my point, but this notion that terminating or discarding human life is somehow a solution to our problems of unwantedness and malnutrition and these sorts of things. You and I both would be run out of town on a rail if we proposed nuking the third world so that we could take care of the poverty problem. Because we know as a society that the destruction of human life is not a solution to those problems. And yet for some reason we suspend that logic when it comes to life in the womb.
So what needs to really change in people's mindsets to abolish legalized abortions? In Canada, the United States, other countries around the world. Does it start with education, maybe when our children are younger?
Well, I think that there's a key element of that. I would answer the question, it has to be a cultural change. I think for too long we've tried to solve this from the top down, get the right judges in the right positions, the right politicians, and politicians will follow where the culture is. I mentioned California earlier. How is it that you can have a law that is so hypocritical and completely inconsistent? Well, it happens because that's where the culture is. If the culture accepts it, that's where politicians will be because they want to be elected. So until the culture changes, which is up to you and I as believers and churches to go out and transform people's hearts, until that happens, I think you're trying to plug holes on a sinking ship, and they're popping up too many. So
you can also vote out the government that doesn't maybe fall in line with your ideologies too and your beliefs, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And political activism certainly has to be part of it. I just hope that folks realize there's so many people that say, well, I've only got one vote. I can't make a difference. You may only have one vote, but you have access to your neighbors and your coworkers to talk to them about this issue, that they'll never hear you or I speak to this issue, but they'll hear you because you're their neighbor. And I think that we all have a part to play in that regard.
Peter Heck, author, public speaker, pro-lifer, joining us from Kokomo, Indiana. Thanks so much for coming by the studio today.
Thank you for having me so much. God bless you, and God bless Canada.
You too.
Thank you.